For 2 whole years, he had saved every coin for the shiny red bicycle in the shop window, the one thing he wanted more than anything in the world. But on the day he finally had enough, he saw an old workhorse being loaded onto a truck bound for slaughter. And what this little boy chose to do with his savings will restore your faith in children. This is Christopher, 10 years old. He lives in a small town where nothing much happens except on livestock auction day. For 730 days, he has done chores, skipped candy, collected pennies, all for a bicycle most kids would have demanded on the spot. But Christopher is not most kids. When he sees a worn-out horse named Pancho facing a one-way trip to the slaughterhouse, he faces an impossible choice. And the moment he makes it, everything changes. The town of San Miguel sits in a dusty valley where nothing much ever happens except on Thursdays. That is livestock auction day, and all the farmers and traders gather under the metal roof of the market pavilion, their voices mixing with the lowing of cattle and the anxious calls of horses. In this town, nobody gets rich, families scrape by, and a 10-year-old boy owning a brand new bicycle is about as rare as snow in July. Christopher had learned this lesson early. His father ran a tiny grocery store that barely covered the rent. His mother took in sewing work, her fingers moving until late into the night. There were no allowances, no birthday windfalls. If he wanted something special, he would have to fight for it himself. The red bicycle had first appeared in the window of Morale's Hardware when Christopher was 8. It had chrome fenders, white wall tires, and a bell that gleamed like gold. He pressed his nose against the glass that day and made a silent vow, "I will own you, no matter how long it takes." So he started saving. He collected empty soda bottles from the roadside and turned them in for the deposit coins. He swept the floors at the butcher shop for a few pesos each week. On weekends, he helped old Senora Gutierrez carry her groceries up the hill, refusing payment at first, but eventually accepting the small coins she insisted on pressing into his palm. He skipped the sweets his friends bought after school, did without new shoes even when his toes began to press against the leather, and every night he dropped whatever he had earned into a glass jar hidden beneath his bed. 2 years, 730 days of small sacrifices. And now, on this Thursday morning, the jar held exactly 1,200 pesos, the full price of the bicycle. He poured the coins into a cloth bag, felt the weight in his hands, and imagined the wind in his hair as he pedaled past the schoolyard, the other kids finally turning to look. His route to the store took him directly past the livestock market. Normally he would hurry by, uninterested, but today the back pens were crowded, and a weathered stock truck was backed up to the loading ramp, its engine already rumbling. It was there that Christopher saw Pancho. The horse was old, older than anything else in the pens. His coat was the color of faded coffee, streaked with gray around the muzzle. His ribs pressed against his hide like the slats of a fence. But it was not the bones that stopped Christopher. It was the eyes. They were dark pools of defeat, a creature who had given everything and now expected nothing but the end. The horse stood motionless as a handler yanked at his lead rope, heading for the ramp. A man in a sweat-stained hat leaned against the fence, clipboard in hand. Christopher tugged his sleeve. "What happens to him?" he asked. The man barely glanced. "He's sold. Kilbaya gave 400 pesos. He'll be on the truck to the slaughterhouse before noon." 400 pesos. Less than half of what Christopher had worked 2 years to save. Less than a bicycle. The handler gave the rope another pull. Pancho did not resist. But his great head turned slowly toward the boy, as if he could sense the only sympathetic soul in the crowd. And in that moment, Christopher's heart cracked wide open. He thought of the bicycle, the shiny chrome, the bell that would announce his arrival. Then he thought of this horse, whose whole life of service was ending in a dusty pen with a one-way ticket to the killing floor. He could not have both. The math was brutal and simple. Christopher did not hesitate for long. He walked past the handler and directly up to the trader, clutching his cloth bag. "I have 1,200 pesos," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "I want to buy the horse." The trader laughed at first, then saw the boy's face and stopped. He looked at the coins spilling onto the table, every last centavo the child owned. Something flickered in the man's eyes, something he had not felt in years. He scooped up the money, untied the rope, and placed it in Christopher's hand. The boy walked out of the auction grounds not on a shiny red bicycle, but with an old, grateful horse plodding beside him. He had traded his dream for a stranger's life, and he did not know yet if he had done something beautiful or something foolish. As they walked the dirt road toward home, Christopher's mind raced. His parents would be terrified. They could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone a worn-out horse. He had no plan, no answer for the questions that would come. All he knew was that he could not have watched Pancho climb onto that truck and done nothing. When he finally reached the front gate, his mother was standing on the porch, her sewing forgotten in her lap. Her face shifted from confusion to shock as she took in the sight of her son leading a bony, exhausted animal. His father came to the door, wiping his hands on his apron, and stopped dead. "What have you done, Christopher?" his mother whispered. But before he could answer, the old horse lifted his head and let out a soft, rumbling nicker. The sound was not one of weariness. It was the sound of a creature who had just realized he was not going to die today. And what none of them knew, standing there in the fading light of that Thursday afternoon, was that Pancho was not an ordinary workhorse. The brand hidden beneath the dirt on his shoulder told a story that would change everything. That brand would soon catch the eye of an elderly neighbor who would stop in his tracks, his face going pale with recognition. Because Pancho had not always been a discarded plow horse. He had once been one of the most prized animals on a famous ranch, and he had been stolen a decade ago in a mystery that had never been solved. The elderly neighbor was Don Esteban, a man of 82 years who had lived on this same street since before the roads were paved. He had been a ranch hand in his youth, one of those men who could read a horse like most people read a newspaper. And when he saw the brand on Pancho's shoulder, partially obscured by dirt and time, he stopped breathing. He walked closer, his gnarled fingers trembling as they brushed away the dust. Beneath the grime, a shape emerged, a five-petaled flower inside a circle, burned into the hide with the precision of a master craftsman. Don Esteban's face went the color of old milk. "Dios mío," he whispered. "This is the mark of Rancho de las Flores." Christopher's parents exchanged a confused glance, but Don Esteban was already speaking, his voice gaining strength as decades-old memories surfaced. Rancho de las Flores was not just any horse farm. It belonged to Don Alejandro Vargas, one of the most respected breeders in 3 states. His stallions won championships. His mares produced bloodlines that wealthy men fought over at auction. And 10 years ago, his most beloved horse had vanished in the middle of the night, stolen by someone who was never caught. The horse's name was Valiant, Brave One. Don Alejandro had raised him from a foal, trained him personally, and wept openly when he discovered the empty stall. He had spent a fortune on private investigators, posted rewards in every town within 200 miles, and refused to replace the horse even as his breeding operations suffered. For a decade, he had kept that stall ready, believing against all reason that Valiant would come home. And now, here he was, standing in Christopher's dusty yard, under the name Pancho, his ribs showing through his hide and his eyes carrying the weight of years of hard labor and neglect. Word travels fast in a small town. Within hours, someone had reached Don Alejandro by telephone. The old breeder, now 71 years old and frail of body, but still sharp of mind, listened in stunned silence. Then he asked for the address and told his driver to start the car. He arrived the next morning as the sun was climbing over the valley. His black sedan pulled up to the modest house, and the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Don Alejandro stepped out slowly, leaning on a cane, his eyes scanning the yard until they found the horse. And when they did, the cane fell to the ground. He walked toward Pancho without a word, his legs unsteady but determined. The horse lifted his head and stood perfectly still. For a long moment, man and animal simply looked at each other across the gap of 10 lost years. Then Pancho let out a soft, rumbling sound, not a nicker of greeting, but something deeper, a sound of recognition that needed no translation. Don Alejandro pressed his forehead against the horse's neck and cried. Silent, shaking sobs that spoke of all the nights he had wondered if his old friend had died in some slaughterhouse or been worked to death in a field. The ranch hands who had accompanied him stood back, removing their hats. Even Christopher, who had never seen a grown man cry like that, felt tears burning behind his own eyes. When Don Alejandro finally found his voice, he told the full story. The thief had been someone he trusted, a temporary stable hand who worked for only 3 weeks before disappearing. The man had cut the fence, loaded Valiant into a trailer in the dead of night, and vanished into the underworld of livestock trading. By the time Don Alejandro realized what had happened, the trail was cold. The horse had passed through at least 5 different owners, his papers lost, his identity erased, his champion bloodline reduced to a nameless plow animal. How he survived all these years, I do not know, Don Alejandro said, his voice cracking. But God has chosen to return him to me through the mercy of a child. And then came the words that Christopher had been dreading. I have come to take him home, Don Alejandro said. He belongs at Rancho de las Flores, where he can live out his remaining years in comfort. Of course, you will be richly compensated, more than richly. Name your price, young man, and you shall have it. Christopher felt the world tilt. He had given up his bicycle, every coin he had saved for 2 years for this horse, and now the horse was being taken away. He would get money, probably far more than the bicycle cost, but that was never the point. The point was that he had looked into Pancho's eyes at the auction and made a promise without words. I will protect you. His mother stepped forward, her voice gentle. Señor Vargas, we understand that he was yours first. But our son gave everything he had to save him. The horse has become special to him. Don Alejandro nodded slowly. He had seen many things in his long life, and he was not a cruel man. But the love of a child, however pure, could not erase a decade of ownership before the theft. The law was clear, and so he believed was justice. He reached for the laid rope, intending to lead Pancho toward the waiting trailer. And that is when something happened that none of them expected. Pancho did not move. The old horse planted his hooves in the dirt and turned his great head toward Christopher. It was not defiance. It was not stubbornness. It was a choice, as clear and deliberate as any creature has ever made. The boy who had saved him was standing 3 feet away, tears streaming down his face, and Pancho would not leave his side. Don Alejandro pulled gently on the rope. Pancho did not budge. He tried again, speaking soothing words, the same commands that had once won championships in show rings. The horse remained rooted, his dark eyes fixed on the small, trembling figure behind him. For the first time in 10 years, Don Alejandro realized that his Valiant, had chosen someone else. The horse had been stolen, yes, but he had also been saved. And those 2 truths were now colliding in the dusty yard of a boy who had given up his dream for a stranger. The old breeder looked from the horse to the child, and something shifted behind his eyes. He let the rope go slack. "Perhaps," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we have more to discuss than I thought." Don Alejandro asked for a chair. Christopher's father brought one from the kitchen, an old wooden thing that creaked under the weight of a lifetime of use, and set it in the shade of the acacia tree. The old breeder lowered himself onto it slowly, as if the weight of the last hour had aged him another 10 years. Pancho stood nearby, still as a statue, his head turned slightly toward Christopher. The boy had not moved either. Tears had dried on his cheeks, leaving pale tracks in the dust that had settled there from the auction grounds. "Tell me everything," Don Alejandro said to the boy, "from the beginning." And Christopher, with his voice still unsteady, told him. He described the 2 years of saving every peso, the glass jar beneath his bed, the morning he woke up knowing he finally had enough. He described the red bicycle in the window of Moral's Hardware, how he had rehearsed the walk 100 times in his head. And then he described the pens behind the auction house, the truck with its engine already running, and the horse with eyes that had given up on life. Don Alejandro listened without interrupting. His face was unreadable, but his fingers gripped the head of his cane until the knuckles went white. When the boy finished, the old man sat in silence for what felt like a very long time. The next thing that happened was something no one expected. Christopher's mother, a quiet woman who rarely spoke above a murmur, stepped forward and placed her hand on Don Alejandro's shoulder. "Señor," she said, "we are not wealthy people. My husband works 16 hours a day and I sew until my fingers bleed. We have never been able to give our son the things other children have. And now he has given away everything he earned, not for a bicycle, but for a life. I do not know what the law says, but I know what my heart says. This horse came to us through an act of grace. Please do not take that away from him." Don Alejandro looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. He had spent the last 10 years consumed by loss, by the wrong that had been done to him. He had imagined this reunion 1,000 times, the triumph, the vindication, the sense of justice finally served. But not once had he imagined a child. Not once had he imagined that the creature he loved would have found someone who loved him too. The old breeder asked for a glass of water and time to think. He retreated to the edge of the yard, where the fence posts leaned at tired angles, and he stood there alone, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the hills. The ranch hands waited by the car, uncertain. The neighbors who had gathered to witness the spectacle whispered among themselves, and through it all, Pancho did not move from Christopher's side. Then came the complication that no one had foreseen. A truck pulled up to the house, and 2 men in official-looking uniforms stepped out. Someone no one ever admitted, who had called the Municipal Livestock Authority. The older of the 2 men introduced himself as Inspector Reyes, and his manner was not kind. "Word reached us that a stolen horse has been identified on this property," he said, flipping through a clipboard. "The animal was reported missing 10 years ago by Don Alejandro Vargas, and we have a legal obligation to impound it pending an investigation into the theft." Christopher felt the world tilt. His father stepped forward, his voice shaking. "The boy bought that horse fair and square, gave 1,200 pesos for it at the auction. There must be a receipt somewhere." The inspector shrugged. "The auction may have sold the animal in good faith, but if the original owner files a claim of theft, the sale can be voided. The horse must be surrendered until the matter is resolved. That is the law." Don Alejandro, still standing by the fence, turned around. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were burning. He walked slowly back toward the group, his cane tapping the hard earth. "I did not call you," he said to the inspector. "I did not ask for this." "With respect, Don Alejandro," the inspector replied, "it does not matter who called. The law is clear. The horse must be taken into custody." Pancho, as if sensing the danger, pressed his muzzle against Christopher's shoulder. The boy wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, his small frame trembling. "You cannot take him," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, he has been through so much. If you put him in some holding pen, he will think we abandoned him. He trusted me." The inspector's expression did not change, but something passed across his face, perhaps a flicker of discomfort, quickly suppressed. He gestured to his partner, who produced a lead rope and began walking toward Pancho. And that is when Don Alejandro raised his cane and blocked the man's path. "No," the old breeder said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the entire yard. "You will not take this horse. Señor the law, I know the law better than you do," Don Alejandro cut him off. "And I am telling you that I will not file a claim of theft." The inspector blinked. "You will not?" Don Alejandro turned to look at Pancho, who had lifted his head now, watching the scene with an attention that seemed almost human. "I spent 10 years believing I was the victim of a crime, and I was. But what happened to this horse after he was stolen, the neglect, the labor, the auction, the truck to the slaughterhouse, that was not my doing. And his rescue was not my doing either. It was this boy, this child who gave everything." He paused, lowering his cane. "If I file a claim, Pancho will be impounded. He will be examined, processed, and held in a facility. He has already suffered more than any living creature should. I will not add to that suffering. The horse stays." The inspector looked at his partner, then back at Don Alejandro. "If you do not file a claim, then there is no theft to investigate. The animal belongs to whoever purchased it at auction." Don Alejandro nodded. "Then make your report and leave." The inspectors departed, their truck kicking up dust as it rumbled back down the road. And the yard fell silent, the kind of silence that settles after a storm has passed. Don Alejandro turned to Christopher. The boy was still holding Pancho, his cheek pressed against the horse's dusty coat. "You gave up your bicycle for him," the old man said. "You gave 2 years of your childhood, and now I have seen with my own eyes that he has chosen you as his person. I will not separate you." Christopher could not speak. His mother wrapped her arms around him, and his father, standing behind them, removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Then Don Alejandro did something that startled everyone. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a checkbook. "You will be compensated," he said firmly. "Not as payment for the horse. Pancho is yours, no money could change that, but as a reward for doing what I was unable to do. You returned hope to an old man, and you saved the life of a creature I thought I had lost forever. That deserves recognition." He wrote the check with a steady hand, tore it from the book, and folded it once before pressing it into Christopher's palm. The boy looked down at the number and gasped. It was not just enough for a red bicycle. It was enough to pay off the family's debts, to fix the leaky roof that had plagued them for years, to fill the pantry with food that did not need to be rationed. It was the kind of money that changed everything. But Don Alejandro was not finished. "Pancho will stay with you," he said, "but I would like to provide for his care. He is an old horse, and old horses have needs: special feed, veterinary attention, comfortable shelter. I will send a monthly allowance to cover all of it, and when the time comes, I will cover the cost of whatever he requires to live his remaining years without pain." He paused, and the ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "As for the bicycle, I understand there is a red one in a window in town. I believe you have earned it twice over." The sun had dipped below the hills by the time Don Alejandro climbed back into his sedan. The ranch hands closed the doors and the engine hummed to life. But before they drove away, the old man rolled down his window and looked one last time at Pancho, who stood in the yard with the boy at his side. "I will visit," Don Alejandro called out. "Every month, if you will have me. I am an old man, and I have missed a decade of my horse's life. I do not wish to miss what remains." Christopher nodded, his hand resting on Pancho's neck. "You are welcome anytime, senor." The sedan pulled away, its taillights fading into the twilight, and Christopher stood in the quiet yard with his horse, his family gathered around him, a check in his pocket that would change their lives, and the knowledge that he had done something that mattered. Not because anyone told him to, not because he expected a reward, but simply because it was right. And the old Workhorse, who had once been a champion called Valiant and was now simply Pancho, lowered his great head and breathed softly against the boy's hand. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something deeper. It was the quiet acknowledgement of two souls who had saved each other in ways neither would ever fully understand. The next morning, Christopher walked into Morale's hardware with his father. The shopkeeper, who had watched the boy press his nose against the window for 2 years, smiled broadly. "I was wondering when you would come," he said. Christopher pointed to the red bicycle. "That one," he said. "I am ready now." He rode it home, the wind in his hair, the bell chiming like a celebration. And when he arrived at his gate, Pancho was waiting, grazing peacefully on the fresh grass that Don Alejandro's generosity had already begun to provide. The horse lifted his head at the sound of the bicycle bell, and if a horse could smile, Pancho did. This is where the story could have ended. A boy, a bicycle, and a horse who had come home. A perfect circle of kindness and reward. But what no one knew yet, what not even Don Alejandro had discovered in his decade-long search, was that the theft of Valiant had been part of something much larger. The stable hand who had disappeared that night with a champion horse in his trailer had not acted alone. He had been part of a network, a quiet syndicate that moved stolen livestock across state lines, erasing identities and selling prized animals for a fraction of their value. And one of the men involved in that network was still operating, still transporting, still invisible. And Christopher, standing at his gate with his new bicycle and his old horse, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would expose it all. The story should have ended there. A boy, a bicycle, and an old horse who had found his way home. A perfect circle of kindness and reward, wrapped in the golden light of a small-town afternoon. But the world is not content with simple endings, and the very next morning, a reporter named Lucia Ortega got a tip from the clerk at the hardware store about a strange transaction involving a child and 1,200 pesos in coins. She followed the thread because she had an instinct for stories that mattered, and by noon she was standing in Christopher's yard with a notebook and a camera, listening to a tale that made her forget to take notes. Within 48 hours, the story of the boy who traded his bicycle for a horse appeared in the regional newspaper under the headline, "El Niño que salvó a Valiant," the boy who saved Valiant. Television crews arrived from the city. Radio hosts called the house. For the first time in his life, Christopher found himself at the center of a world that had previously ignored him entirely. He handled it with a quiet grace that surprised even his own parents, answering questions in his steady voice, never once boasting, never once pretending he had done anything more than what his heart had told him was right. But it was not the television crews who changed everything. It was a retired police investigator named Captain Guillermo Herrera who saw the photograph of Pancho's brand in the Sunday edition of the paper. He had spent 15 years hunting a livestock trafficking ring that operated across 3 states, a syndicate that stole prized horses, erased their identities, and sold them at small-town auctions where nobody asked questions. The ring had been dormant for years, or so they thought, and the sudden reappearance of a long-lost champion from Rancho de las Flores set off alarm bells in Herrera's mind. He drove 5 hours that same afternoon, arriving at Christopher's house just as the sun was setting. What followed was a chain of revelations so precise they could have been scripted. Herrera recognized the mark of the trafficking ring immediately. The fake sale documents, the pattern of moving horses through quiet auction houses far from their original stables, the way each stolen animal was funneled through a network of small, independent traders who worked on cash and anonymity. The stable hand who had stolen Valiant a decade earlier, a man named Felipe Rojas, had vanished after the theft, but he had not stopped working. He had simply become more careful, building a quiet empire of stolen livestock that stretched from the border towns to the highlands. And now, because a 10-year-old boy had looked into the eyes of a dying horse and decided to give up his bicycle, the entire network was about to crumble. Herrera, with Don Alejandro's help, cross-referenced auction records, interviewed traders who had handled Pancho during his years of neglect, and followed a paper trail that led directly to Rojas, who was operating under a false name just 2 towns away. The arrest made national news. Half a dozen other stolen animals were recovered in the raid that followed: a mare that had been missing for 3 years, a young stallion whose owner had all but given up hope, and 2 other agging horses who had been worked nearly to death. All of them found their way to safety because a child had paid $40 for a stranger. Christopher, still barely tall enough to reach Pancho's neck, became an unexpected symbol of something the world had forgotten: that kindness is never wasted, and even the smallest person can set the mightiest gears in motion. He was given awards he did not want. He was photographed more times than he could count, and through it all, he remained exactly who he had always been: a quiet boy who loved a horse. Don Alejandro became a permanent fixture in their lives. He visited every month, just as he had promised, driving his black sedan through the dusty streets until it became as familiar as the mail truck. He would sit for hours in the yard, his cane propped against his knee, watching Pancho graze in the soft afternoon light. Sometimes he told stories about the horse's early years: the first time Valiant won a ribbon, the way he could turn on a dime during training, the intelligence in his eyes that had always set him apart. Christopher listened to every word, cataloging them in the secret place where children store the things they know they will carry forever. The years that followed were gentle ones. Pancho, freed from the yoke and the auction and the long, hungry roads, settled into a quiet rhythm of grazing and sleeping and being loved. The monthly allowance from Don Alejandro ensured he had the best feed, the softest bedding, and the finest veterinary care available. His coat, once dull and matted, grew glossy again. His ribs disappeared beneath a healthy layer of muscle, and his eyes, those dark pools that had first captured Christopher's heart, regained a brightness that seemed to speak of contentment, of a long and difficult journey finally at rest. Christopher grew too. He finished school, took on responsibilities at his father's store, and eventually became a young man who no longer needed a bicycle to feel the wind in his hair. But every evening, without fail, he would walk out to the paddock and spend a quiet hour with Pancho, just as he had promised on that first dusty afternoon. Their bond never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming something beyond words, beyond the simple categories of owner and pet. They were 2 souls who had found each other at the exact moment when each needed the other most. On a cool morning in the 6th year after his rescue, Pancho lay down in the soft grass of his paddock and did not get up. He was old, older than anyone had realized, and his great heart, which had carried him through championships and theft and neglect, and finally into the arms of a family who loved him, had simply run its course. Christopher was with him as he had been from the beginning, his hand resting on the horse's neck, his voice steady and low, telling him he was a good boy and always had been. When the veterinarian confirmed what Christopher already knew, the young man did not weep immediately. He sat beside Pancho for a long while, watching the sun climb, and then he walked inside and told his family. The funeral was small and quiet. Don Alejandro came, his cane now a permanent necessity, his own body beginning its slow decline. The townspeople gathered at the edge of the property, holding candles, remembering the day the story had first broken. They buried Pancho beneath the acacia tree where he had loved to stand in the shade, and they planted flowers that would bloom every spring for decades to come. And Christopher, standing before the small crowd, spoke words that no one who heard them would ever forget. He did not talk about the awards or the news coverage or the notorious ring that had been brought to justice. He talked about the first moment he saw Pancho at the auction and how the old horse had looked at him as if to say, "I am still worth saving." He talked about the bicycle and how he had never once regretted the trade. And he talked about the lesson that his mother had taught him years earlier, one he had finally understood in the presence of this gentle creature, that every life, no matter how worn or broken, deserves someone who will fight for it. As he finished, a single tear traced a path down his cheek. Somewhere nearby, a bicycle bell chimed in the distance, a child riding home from school perhaps, and the sound was like a benediction, a small bright note that promised the world would keep turning and kindness would keep finding its way back. There is a question that often goes unasked when we hear stories like Christopher's. We celebrate the outcome, the miracle, the triumph of kindness over cruelty, but we rarely stop to ask ourselves, what would I have done? If you had saved for 2 years, every coin a small sacrifice, and stood at the crossroads between a long-held dream and a stranger's life, would you have walked into that auction and handed over everything? Christopher did not know Pancho's history. He did not know he was a stolen champion or that his rescue would dismantle a criminal network. He only knew that a living creature was about to die and he could not bear it. That is the radical simplicity of compassion. It does not calculate. It does not wait for guarantees. It acts. The story of the boy and the horse reminds us that the smallest hands can move the heaviest weights. A child's choice rippled outward, returning a stolen animal to an old man who had never stopped hopping, exposing a trafficking ring that had operated in the shadows for years, and proving to a town and then a nation that decency is never obsolete. Pancho grazed peacefully for 6 gentle years beneath an acacia tree, and when his time came, he was surrounded by love. That is not a small thing. In a world that often feels too large and too broken to fix, it is everything. If this story moved you, let it be a reminder that your own choices matter more than you know. There is always a moment where you can be the person who stops, who looks, who acts. You may never see the full chain of events you set in motion, but trust that the chain exists. Kindness given freely has a way of returning, not always in the form you expect, but always in the form you need. Before we go, we have a small favor to ask. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope and humanity to people all around the world. And we would love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. It reminds us that we are all connected, no matter how far apart we may seem. Thank you for being here. Until next time, keep believing in the power of a single act of kindness.